think that's part of the responsibility of a science fiction writer is any technology we show or invent, we have to show going wrong.
NPR did a story about that where they were saying science fiction writers are complementary to scientists because we challenge what they're creating and could even introduce possible risks. And, you know, while scientists can go, well, that's fictional, but we're writing from a very human perspective, and it's good to think of all those angles.
I saw a meme a while ago online, which was science will tell you what you can do, humanities will tell you why it might not be a good idea.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. NASA predicts it will land astronauts on Mars by 2040. SpaceX says it will beat NASA by at least a decade. What does it take to get us off Earth and exploring the rest of the planets in our solar system? And what will we find when we get there? Science fiction writers have been speculating this for decades. I am so excited to welcome Gareth L. Powell to the podcast to discuss planetary travel. Gareth is a multi-BSFA-Award-Winning British science fiction author who writes action-packed epic adventures. His latest book, Stars and Bones, is out now, and his Embers of War novels are currently being adapted for the screen. I really enjoyed recording this episode, and I think you'll enjoy listening to it too. So thank you for joining Speculative Sandbox. You and I are coming from separate continents, you in the UK, me in the United States, but you just visited us for a little bit, or you came to California. So how did you enjoy your time stateside?
Oh, I love it. Absolutely love it. That was my second time in 6 weeks.
Awesome. What was your favorite part?
Oh, too many to talk about. I mean, we visited all the bookshops in LA and San Diego and La Jolla and everywhere we could find a speculative fiction bookshop or geeky teas.
Nice.
As well. So love it. Love that whole area, sort of Eagle Rock, Glendale, Pasadena, Santa Monica, the whole lot, San Diego. Great. Nice.
What about the food?
Oh, so much food. So many tacos. Yeah, it's just amazing. We ate at so many different places, and everywhere we went the food was just fantastic. Whether it was like diner breakfast or In-N-Out burger or a proper restaurant, we found fantastic food everywhere.
What would you say is the most different or interesting or startling culture change about coming to the United States compared to the UK?
The thing that struck me on my first visit was that everything there is such a cultural touchstone. Everywhere I went, I was walking along streets whose names I'd read in hundreds of books and heard referenced on TV shows. Every location I'd kind of heard somebody say something about it. I'd go to Santa Monica and my mind would be playing songs with the lyrics in. I went in the Hollywood Hills and there were Eagles lyrics popping up in my head. And it was just amazed me how much those square miles of Los Angeles and that bit of the coast are so embedded in popular culture, just in movies, films, and especially music, that it just felt that I was kind of walking through a kind of unreal film set at times. And it just made me realize the huge impact that Hollywood and that area has had on global culture.
Mm-hmm. I have a little bit of that. I live in the desert, and so I usually, when I see my land, my home captured in movies, it's always in the Wild Wild West context. So anytime I leave Arizona and I go into California, I feel, or anywhere else really, where there's trees and grass, I feel like it's always a movie. It's so foreign to me. Okay, so you were so awesome. I had put out a call for guests, and I really wanted to talk about planetary travel, specifically colonies on our planets in our solar system. And I said, who wants to talk about this? And you offered, and I was like, this is perfect. So thank you so much for raising your hand and being a part of this podcast.
No worries.
So my thought was to just kind of move through the planets, but first I wanted to talk about space colonies and why they're a staple of science fiction. So for you, what makes them so fun or maybe so challenging to write?
Um, my views on science fiction on space colonies are very different from my views on real life space colonies.
Mhm.
Um, for instance, I love writing and reading books set on Mars, but when it comes to real life propositions for going and living on Mars, I kind of you know the place is a freezing cold
Mhm.
hellscape with highly radioactive surface, air pressure so low you'd have to wear a pressure suit to go outdoors, dust so fine it would just destroy your lungs, it would get in everywhere and everything. So from that point of view, if Elon Musk came and said, Gareth, do you want to come to Mars with me? I'd be like, absolutely no way, Elon. Um, but on the other hand, Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars is one of my favorite books,
Mhm.
because I just love the way he uses it as a way to basically rerun um, the history of America um, from scratch, but against a completely different background.
So
And
it
how you
become Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, and he shows how you can set up a fair and equitable society using various different um, ways of doing it, and various different philosophies, and how you can bring that all together if you have the will and the opportunity. Um, so, yeah, for me, space colonies are, in a lot of ways, in fiction, they're just microcosms that allow us to look at our world and comment on our world by externalizing it and using it as a small example, almost like a metaphor,
Yeah.
um, rather than a serious proposition.
I agree with you on the space travel thing. When I watch movies that are about like realistic astronaut experiences, to me it seems to be very anxiety inducing. And there are people that are just so brave and they will don that suit. And if Elon Musk goes, I'm going to make you one of the first people to, set up a home on Mars, they'll be like, sign me up. And I'm like, I'm glad we have people like you because I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
So, looking back on space colonization and fiction, there seems to be a line right around the mid-century, where before that it's all pulp fiction. Before we knew or understood anything about the scientific structures of planets, anything could be on Venus and Mars. Venus was envisioned to have dinosaurs walking on Mars. It's a lush tropical paradise. But then after all the NASA information came out about what these planets were made of and what their living conditions are like, then the fiction changed with it and started to take on some of the challenges of those scientific conditions. What are your thoughts on pulp fiction and then after pulp fiction?
Uh, well, yeah, as you say, in the early part of the century, I mean, a lot of science fiction was basically westerns,
Mhm.
um, with space colonies, um, instead of small towns in the Midwest. So, and the heroes would ride in on a rocket ship, sort stuff out, get back on the rocket ship, and go away again.
Kind of like
Um,
Mandalorian now. I don't know if you've seen that, but a very
yeah,
Western approach.
it's very Western. But I think as well, we had, if you go back to look at, because coming from the UK, we were very much a naval nation, and there was a lot of exploring, and sort of in the 16th, 17th century, there were all sorts of tales of these foreign lands that the sailors went off to. And there were sort of well documented stories of men who had no head but had a face in their stomach, or
Mm.
two headed people, or all these weird sort of basically aliens that lived in these foreign lands. And the sailors came back and told these tales, because we were populating the world using imagination. And the same thing was happening in the solar system. I remember when I was at school, I read a book called Kings of Space, by a writer called Captain W.E. Johns, who's most famous for writing World War One and World War Two fighter pilot fiction about a character called Biggles. And in his books, there's a Scottish inventor and his plucky young son meet a weird scientist in Scotland who's built a flying saucer, and off they go, and they discover, as you say, that Venus is a lush tropical swamp, and Mars is a desiccated desert filled with warlike people. And the asteroid belt used to be a planet, but that's where they destroyed it because there was a war, and now they're afraid humanity has invented the atom bomb and is going to do the same thing, so they're trying to step in. And at the point that was written, that was fair enough speculation that there might be civilizations on these two planets. But then as our scientific awareness has broadened and our probes have gone out and reached things, we start to realize no. So we've had to push back this frontier that in the 16th and 17th century was across the sea, and then in the 20th century was on neighboring planets, and now in the 21st century is maybe out in other solar systems, other galaxies. So we're always pushing back the frontier of where weirdness is.
So it seems like as we further our knowledge of the universe, then we are always going to be wondering what's beyond even that.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like a Schrodinger's cat thing, that the more we look, the further away the weirdness has to be, because all those possibilities collapse down into a single wave function, and we know what Mars is now because we've had a look at it. So we've opened the box and found a desert. So I find those tales, going back to your original question, very much part of a long tradition of explorers' tales. That is just the sea is changing.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's like pirates too. Westerns and pirates, it's all telling the same idea, but on a different frontier.
Yes, absolutely. It's Westerns, pirates, but also the Roman Empire. That tends to get recycled a lot.
Okay.
In terms of sort of intergalactic empires, and they all look suspiciously Roman. They all have the senators, they all have the emperor, and the palace intrigue. So those are kind of, I think those are the staples, the sort of the Venn diagram of science fiction in a lot of ways.
Interesting. So that makes me think of the Apple TV series Foundation with Lee Pace. When you say Roman Empire, it makes me think of the emphasis on the empire that's ruling, and it does kind of have that classic feel to it.
Yes, very much. And I think that's probably because most of Western literature kind of has the sort of classical models of Rome and Greece and Egypt are our kind of precursor civilizations, and we took a lot from them wholesale. And so in a lot of ways, sort of Herodotus's histories and all that kind of literature, the plays of Sophocles and stuff, they're kind of like almost our myths beneath, on top of which we built all our medieval literature and everything else. So it's not surprising that I think our literary imagination is kind of shaped by those Mediterranean cultures in a lot of ways.
So then the fun part so we have the establishment of cultures and societies, and then you throw in the post-mid-century discoveries of science, the scientific conditions of the planets, and now you get to play with science. In my research, I saw that there was about 3 different ways that humans can create colonies on other planets. The first one is terraforming, which is changing the planet to suit our needs. Then there's pantropy, which is changing the human to adapt to other planets. And then there's life support systems like domed cities, underground cities, that sort of stuff. What do you think is the most interesting type of adaptation or colonialism that to write or to read?
From a fiction point of view, probably the most interesting is pantropy. Talking about the different ways humans can be adapted to their different environments and how that would kind of bifurcate the species, and we would end up with lots of different descendant species of humans. I think Frederick Powell kind of looked at this in, I think it was a novel called Gem, I might be wrong, where he looks at a man who is adapted to survive on the surface of Mars. And since then, that's been done in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of different stories. And Stephen Baxter's written a lot of stories about humans who've been adapted to survive in different environments and then lost contact with Earth and developed their own ways and their own societies and so on. So I think from a fictional point of view, that has the most kind of potential. Terraforming seems to take a very long time. Although you could argue that what we've done to the environment here on Earth, we've done over the last 200 years. So it's maybe not as long a time as people think. Although maybe terra wrecking is easier than terraforming.
Sure.
And I would, if we were going to put in any large-scale terraforming effort, I'd like us to do that here on Earth first.
Yeah. The idea that you can completely change a planet, like I've seen ones where you create a giant umbrella to cool down Venus. I'm like, well, can we think about how that could help Earth first?
Exactly, because Earth is obviously the most Earth-like planet we know of. So let's just try and fix that before we try and build another one. And fixing that will teach us how to build another one. Because we can't possibly take 8 billion people to a new planet. So some of us are going to be stuck here anyway. So let's fix our own shit before we go and start messing around with somebody else's. And the life support systems, I mean, basically that's just dragging along a whole lot of plumbing and a food supply for some curious apes who've, escaped from Africa and are now, at large in the universe, and totally unsuited to it. So, I mean, the universe kind of knows that we shouldn't be out there, and it's got a million ways to kill us, from radiation to vacuum to cold to overheating in the spaceship because it's so well insulated. So, we shouldn't be there. So maybe we need to be adapted for it. But then we've done it before, because I mentioned we escaped from Africa. The human exodus, the various waves, moving up into Europe, we had to develop technology in order to survive. Because an unclothed human, I mean, I live in the UK. I wouldn't survive a winter stark naked outdoors.
How cold does it get out there?
It gets down to sort of, I think, probably about -5 to -10 in the winter sometimes.
Okay.
Which isn't that cold, but...
You know what mine gets down to?
What?
50 degrees Fahrenheit. Like it's so warm here. My winters are other people's summers, but my summers get pretty intense, and I wouldn't want to, like, if I didn't have shelter, I'd be screwed.
Yikes. So yeah, exactly. So we've had to, and when we came out of Africa, we were moving into the teeth of an ice age that was gripping Europe, and so we had to invent the technology, or steal from the technology invented by Neanderthals, of furs and fire and hunting and shelter, and all these technologies that we just take for granted, that we couldn't actually survive without. So moving into space isn't that huge a psychological jump in that would be reliant on technology, because most of us already are. But it would still be a huge resource drain compared to, maybe sending an intelligent machine, which would need solar panels, and would fit into something the size of a suitcase, maybe. So it swings and roundabouts.
I can see. I see what you mean about it, all three of these ways. Actually, I would hope that by the time we turn these methods to other planets, that we've figured out how to do it on our planet. Because life support systems, I guess we can combat certain climate change issues by doming our cities or moving underground. And I think if we can't figure out how to do that here, it'd be harder for us to do it out there. But I wonder if it's a matter of, it's hard to do that here. It's messy. There's so many people and their opinions, where it's, me being in charge of my space station. I'm Elon Musk. I'll just send a dome city onto the moon and no one's going to fight with me and I get to just do what I want.
Yeah, I mean, that scenario brings up its own problems in that, for instance, if you have, I won't pick on Elon, but if you have a billionaire who founds his own space colony, whether it's on Mars or on the moon or whatever, why would he still be in charge if money is no longer relevant?
Okay.
What is his power? And his only power would be control of the life support system. So in that case, the inhabitants of the colony would be basically held at hostage, because that would be his only leverage of control. Because once you get out there and you've got this new world, and you think, why would the existing power structures carry on just because this guy paid for the rocket? Just because he paid for the Uber to Mars, why do you still have to listen to him? So there would be a kind of, it's the same problem. I see a lot of people talking about, rich people talking about surviving doomsday or prepping for ecological collapse, and they're saying, how do I keep my security staff from turning on me? Because all my money will no longer, what can they spend it on once the bomb has dropped or whatever? So how do I stop my security staff turning on me? And I've seen suggestions, explosive collars, or I have the key to the food cupboard or whatever. But that just turns everyone into a hostage, and that isn't maybe the brave new world they're trying to create. So I think a lot more thought needs to be given to the composition of these societies before you end up maybe living on a planet where you have to work for your air and water. Because if you don't, you die of thirst, or you're chucked out onto the planetary surface and suffocate. So it's something I haven't seen so much in fiction. I've seen kind of the revolution against against Earth, and we're going to declare independence, but I've not seen the one where the person who basically owns the space colony manages to justify why they are in charge and why people should keep listening to them.
By the landlord should be the powerful one. So then, do you think, I've seen articles like in the past where you hear about billionaires vying for property. Do you think property is one way where you can secure your power on another planet?
Only in so far as habitable property.
Okay.
So if they own the dome, which has all the air, then that will be quite valuable real estate. But if it's a planet, for instance, that's been terraformed, at least partially, and people can breathe without having to be reliant on certain supplies, and if people can grow their own food, property is literally kind of dirt cheap, because you've got a whole world you can just go out into and settle and just, stake a claim and say, right, this bit's mine. Kind of like, kind of like in America, where there were land rushes and people would go out and stake a claim and build a house and start a farm. How much is the property worth in that case? So if a billionaire owns 2,000 square miles, big deal, because there's another 2,000 miles next door that has nobody in it at all. So you could just go out there and keep the frontier moving until you've covered the entire planet. So
so there's going to be a process no matter what, some sort of fight. Okay. So let's start with our good old rocky planets, which Earth is obviously a part of. We have Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and I'll just walk through a little bit of what conditions we writers are dealing with when we're writing about these colonies. So rocky planets are made mostly of rock and metal. They have a hot core surrounded by a layer of hot rock called the mantle. And on the surface is a thin layer of solid rock called the crust. Rocky planets are smaller than gas planets, but are made of heavier materials. And of course, those that are closer to the sun experience a lot more heat. So of the planets I named, which one stands out to you the most as challenging or most interesting to colonize?
or sort of taking them in order out from the sun, Mercury, the heat on the day side of Mercury is blistering.
Mhm.
Um, and Mercury itself is little more than the core of a larger planet, with the outer layers have all been stripped away. So it hasn't got much in the way of kind of a magnetic field, and there isn't much crust or mantle. What it is, I mean, it's mostly just a sort of solidified core. So I don't see any advantage to colonizing Mercury. I don't see why anyone would want to colonize Mercury,
Mhm.
because of the heat and the radiation, unless it was to kind of put solar collectors on the surface in order to collect power to beam to other parts of the solar system.
I was reading 2312 by Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah,
Have you read that one?
I've not, no.
Okay, so this will be might be interesting to you. The city of Terminator is one of the it's the only colony on Mercury, and the way he handled the fact that it's extremely hot all the time on the sun facing side of the planet is that there is a track that wraps the whole planet, and the city is domed and it sits on the track, and it's always sitting at that point right before dawn or dusk. And as the sun heats up the track expands and keeps pushing the city into the dark, and
Ah,
the city just keeps rolling around like that. And what ends up being the inciting incident for the book is someone bombs that track, the city can't move on it anymore, and it just roasts in the sun. I just thought that was so interesting.
I believe he used that in Blue Mars, or one of his other books as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I've certainly read. I don't think I've read that book, but I've certainly read something by him about that, where I think two characters get trapped on the surface and they have to run to catch up with the city.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that is, but, why go to all that trouble?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that would be an incredibly precarious existence.
Yeah.
Um,
You're constantly living on the edge. It's a city for like adrenaline junkies.
yeah, literally on the edge. And, you're only a few minutes from getting completely vaporized.
Hmm.
So at any one time. So, yeah, I mean, that strikes me as probably one of the most unlikely.
Okay.
Venus has a surface temperature that can melt lead. Used to be fairly Earth-like, but gradually the water escaped into space and was broken up, and the hydrogen escaped into space, and everything boiled, and you're left with these clouds and this oven-like surface temperature. I'm not sure, quite what set that off, but it's the greenhouse effect. I think the fact that Venus might be the only planet that's rolling around the sun on its side
Mm.
could suggest that maybe a catastrophic impact knocked it sideways and set off this greenhouse effect.
Do you think that
Um,
Venus is a warning for Earth, or you think that it's a completely different set of conditions?
I think Venus and Mars both show how an Earth-like planet can go wrong.
Okay.
I mean, they're almost too perfect um, in being warnings, because there was a brief time where all three of them had liquid water on their surface. So all three of them could possibly have hosted life at the same time. And then Mars obviously wasn't dense enough to hold on to its atmosphere, and it gradually thinned. Um, and once the once radiation breaks up the H2O and the hydrogen's gone,
Hmm.
and the oxygen bonds to anything it can, so you've got a very rusty red planet, and the hydrogen's gone, so you can't have water again because all the hydrogen's gone. And yeah, the same with Venus, but for slightly different. For the opposite reason, that it got hotter, Mars got colder. Yeah, but I think in order to colonize Venus, you would either have to colonize the upper atmosphere, or find a way to strip all those clouds away. And I don't know how you would do that. Maybe some kind of algae in the cloud layer to generate oxygen and to um, create water somehow. I have no idea. If we invent, some form of nanotechnology that can push molecules around and just create whatever it likes out of whatever it likes, then all bets are off.
Mm-hmm.
You could just drop a load of nanotech into the atmosphere and it would turn it all into oxygen and nitrogen. Easy peasy. But assuming we haven't got that kind of technology anytime soon, it would be a very big challenge.
Would that be a form of terraforming to alter the atmosphere like that? Or is it different?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because we would have to make it more Earth-like in order to survive on there. And however bad Earth gets, it's going to be easier to do that on Earth than it is on Venus, because it doesn't get any worse than Venus.
Okay, so NASA, I think, likes the floating colony concept. When I was doing my research, they had something called the NAVOC program, which conceptualized a floating colony. They were talking about the same conditions you're talking about, and they're looking at about 50 kilometers above the surface of Venus. The environment changes to the most Earth surface-like conditions within the solar system suitable for supporting airships. And of course, they have to figure out a lot of things like air pressure concerns and corrosiveness. But NASA spent some time on this hypothetical situation that ended up not really going anywhere, but I guess gave them more information.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to the same question as Mercury. Why go to all that bother? Because you will again be living in a very precarious position, and maybe not so much protection from solar radiation that high up in the air. And if your airship fails, you're falling down into something, a burning hell that will literally melt your bones. So, I can't imagine sleeping very soundly on one of those airships.
Interesting for fiction, but not what you want to deal with in reality.
Yeah, I can't imagine anyone going, well, the Earth is getting a bit dirty. Let's go and live on an airship above a roasting hellscape. It doesn't seem appealing,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my theory is if a toddler can't make it through the living conditions without going through some demise, it's probably not a good idea. I mean, it's already hard enough for toddlers to navigate Earth, but yeah, if it's something that, like Mercury, if you have to constantly stay one step away from the sun, or Venus, where you got to hope that your airship works, I can't imagine humanity lasting much longer.
No, and you have to make those technologies incredibly durable for a long time, but also idiot proof and terrorist proof. So that just raises it to a whole level of challenge that we can't make cars that don't fall apart after 10 years really. So a whole city in one of the most challenging environments possible, able to deal with huge swings in temperature, that's going to last 100 years. I don't see it at the moment somehow.
As a writer, how do you, when you're facing these kinds of circumstances, because I always feel like it's such a great writing exercise when you look at all the different conditions and societal expectations, to be able to look at these challenges and go, okay, I've come up with an interesting solution. How much responsibility do you think it is on the writer to continue challenging and pushing new ideas? Or do you think it's like we're all free to just do whatever we want and that's all just suspend reality?
As a writer, I like to keep what I'm writing at least plausible.
Okay.
Even if highly unlikely. So, because the environments I'm generating as I go, as I mentioned at the beginning, are to kind of serve the needs of the story and to create these interesting societal microcosms we can use to examine, like simulations through which we can examine society or examine human nature or examine our relationship with the universe or with technology or whatever. So they're more like sort of stage settings for a particular dramatization of a philosophical or dramatic point. Whereas I don't think any of us are, I might be wrong, but I don't think any of us are seriously sitting down and going, right, I'm going to design something that will work and can be done right now, and here's all the specs and the design. We all fudge a little bit because we're not playing in the realm of strict science we're playing in the realm of fiction,
Mhm.
and however much science we put into our fiction, however plausible we try to make it, at some point we have to make massive assumptions. Um, and, assumptions that the human race is going to survive the next 50 years for a start. That's a big assumption.
Yeah.
And so we have to go from there, and we, that we'll be able to afford to get into space, that we'll find a way of living in space long enough to create these places. We'll find a way of traveling those distances. We'll find a way of getting the resources to do that. And at the moment, we don't have those resources. It would take the resources of the entire planet to create a space colony.
Mm.
So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's
Yeah.
definitely an interesting one. But yeah, I think it's fun to build space colonies. It's fun to build space colonies that go wrong in interesting and dramatic ways. And I think that's part of the responsibility of a science fiction writer, is any technology we show or invent, we have to show going wrong.
Absolutely. NPR did a story about that where they were saying science fiction writers are complementary to scientists because we challenge what they're creating and could even introduce possible risks. And, while scientists can go, well, that's fictional, but we're writing from a very human perspective. And it's good to think of all those angles.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a meme a while ago online, which was, science will tell you what you can do, humanities will tell you why it might not be a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think the illustration that came with it was from Jurassic Park.
Yes,
So, yeah.
that's a really good example. So Mars is our other neighbor and just dry, 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 dry and cold. So do you think, based off of whether or not it's worth inhabiting a planet, do you think Mars is worth it?
I don't know about worth it. I mean, Mars is one of, Mars and Venus, the two most Earth-like planets we can feasibly get to in a human lifetime at the moment. And as you say, it's just desolate, absolutely desolate and dry as a bone. So unless we discover huge reserves of underground water there and can find a way to stop them all, bring them to the surface, but stop them all escaping immediately into space and being broken apart and freezing and what have you, then assuming we can do that, and assuming maybe we can crash an absolute ton of comets into the atmosphere to raise the humidity and generate a false atmosphere, and heat the place up through the impacts, that process would take a very long time and would basically trash the surface all over again. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, all that stuff could be done, but it would be like a medieval stonemason setting out to build a cathedral. He starts doing it, but he knows that his great grandson will probably be the one who finishes it. So it's a generational project.
So you mentioned you liked writing about Mars. What are some of your favorite creations
On Mars?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, what creations that I've created or creations I've read about?
That you've created?
Oh, right. I don't know. I mean, I've written some short stories, sort of set in domed cities where things are going wrong, or set on outposts in craters which have had domes put over them and atmospheres put in, and so on. So I mean, the story I think of most when I think of a story I wrote which was set on Mars was a story called The Last Reef that was published in Interzone way back in 2005 or 2006. But that, as again, was basically a space western,
Okay.
set around a rogue nanotech outbreak. But yeah, Mars very much does have the feel of the Wild West.
When you say rogue nanotech outbreak, I'm picturing little nanobots running around. Am I wrong?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, I pictured that NASA had upgraded it's got an interplanetary communication network it wants to build,
Hmm.
with various relay stations. And I pictured that becoming very complicated and eventually achieving self-awareness and upgrading itself into a kind of hyperspeed nirvana, which we couldn't follow. Only there's one relay that was shut down for maintenance when that happened, and wakes up to find everything else is gone and it's there all by itself.
Oh.
And then there's the humans get involved with it. But it's yeah, I mean, Mars is tantalizing because we can see how maybe it used to be like the Earth, and we can see how maybe it could be like the Earth again. I love those mock-ups people do of what Mars would look like with a sea and an atmosphere, because it makes you just think, oh wow, you know,
Hmm.
so close. But whether we, whether we can do that in a realistic time frame is a completely another matter. But a terraform Mars, great place to set a story. Absolutely.
Okay. So once we move past the rocky planets, we enter our gas planets. And these are the ones I love looking. Well, it's Jupiter and Saturn. I love looking through telescopes
Yeah.
at. They're just gorgeous. So we have Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, the furthest planets from the sun. They each have many, many moons that are probably more viable, mostly more viable than the actual planet themselves for colonizing. They're massive, they're balls of hydrogen and helium, and you couldn't stand on the surface because it's not solid. And according to my very, highly sophisticated research into Wikipedia,
Mhm.
we immediately face an obstacle, which is that gas giants are not suitable for colonization and there's no accessible surface. The light hydrogen atmosphere would not provide good buoyancy for some kind of aerial habitat. What are your thoughts about Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune?
You missed out the fact they're also savagely radioactive.
Oh, yes, you're right.
So there's just no way. There's no way we could colonize even the upper atmospheres of a gas giant without some radical technology that we just don't have or can't even conceptualize at the moment.
So why are
Um,
they so radioactive? Is it their size, their composition?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I just know that apparently a lot of studies into colonizing some of the moons of Jupiter have pointed out that the radiation from Jupiter would render them completely
Mm,
uninhabitable. Sorry.
gotcha.
Um, and then you've got places like Titan, which people think might one day, but the seas there are made from hydrocarbons, not water. So it's an entirely different milieu than we're used to.
Hmm. We would have
Talk
to
about
pantropy ourselves if we wanted to live
yeah.
there.
I read I remember reading a book. I think it's called Titan by Stephen Baxter, where he sends a team of astronauts there, and they fall into the one of these freezing hydrocarbon seas and are frozen and are revived a billion years later, when the sun has started to swell and consume the inner planets. But then it's springtime on Titan, and all this life has evolved using water ice instead of carbon to create skeletons and bones and so forth. So he postulates a whole using a completely different set of chemicals and a completely different set of building blocks. This life that could arise on Titan, but it's radically unsuitable for us
Interesting.
as we are.
Okay.
Um,
I read that Saturn, if someone had to pick out of all of the outer planets, what could be the most favorable, if realistic at all, they said Saturn because there's 82 moons to choose from, and that the radiation belt is supposedly weaker than Jupiter's, but I don't know if it's significant enough to be meaningful. But
yeah.
they're talking about harvesting the rings. Lots of notes on harvesting, which I always wonder: are they harvesting to then create their domed cities, or it's just talking about new natural resources?
If they can harvest water ice from the rings,
Okay.
then you can use that water those big chunks of water ice to either crash into your chosen moon to create a atmosphere that, I mean, that won't last long, but maybe will last a couple of thousand years before it all boils off. Or you can use it to, I mean, we are basically 70% water. We need a constant influx to keep ourselves from drying out. So you can use it for that. I mean, whatever we do to grow crops, anything we do, we're going to need water. And Saturn looks like a great big rest stop on the edge of the solar system. So I can see that being a great place. There's also the ice moons that perhaps have oceans underneath. If maybe you drill down through a couple of kilometers of ice, there's this ocean, and maybe we could live in those oceans, protected from the radiation by the couple of kilometers of ice above us. Maybe we could have this sub-aquatic life down there, growing seaweed and other plants and what have you. So that's a good possibility.
Okay.
But also there's the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, where you have things like Ceres, which is I think the biggest, which is sort of getting on for the size of a moon. It's so large that its gravity has collapsed it into a spherical shape.
And it's in the asteroid belt?
It's in the asteroid belt.
Okay.
There are a few others at Vesta, and my memory for names isn't what it once was. And it's possible you could create subterranean societies there. I mean, in The Expanse, they have a belter civilization that exists in the asteroid belt, trading between the rocks and mining the rocks, because some of those asteroids, it's estimated, just one big asteroid can contain enough gold and platinum to completely revolutionize the entire Earth's economy. There's huge wealth there, and if you could somehow create a civilization there, but the distances involved are enormous because all those rocks are so far apart. And you'd have to get water and air and stuff to them. So again, you face that challenge, but then they're out in space and they're not dependent on a planet, which may or may not have a lethal radioactive belt around it. So
Interesting. So if we lived in the asteroid belt, is it a pretty stable asteroid belt, or would we have to worry about collisions?
I think it's pretty stable because Jupiter keeps it stable. Jupiter's like a shepherd, and it keeps it. I think Jupiter has stopped a lot of those asteroids from falling inwards and causing trouble. The problems come out in the Oort cloud, which is way beyond Pluto, when something disturbs something else there gravitationally, and it comes in and it maybe knocks, gravitationally affects something and sends things. But the asteroids in the asteroid belt, it looks crowded when you look at a map of the solar system, but they are so far apart that the chances of two of them hitting each other are just literally astronomical. But they're always revolving at different rates.
Okay.
So they're always in different relationships to each other. So maybe if you lived on an asteroid and your neighbor lived on another asteroid 100,000 kilometers from you, as you went around the sun, you would be going a lot faster because they were further out. So after a while, you'd be on opposite sides of the sun, and then you'd gradually start catching up again. So it would be a very different way of imagining territory than we imagine it now.
And are they spinning too? Is there any internal gravity, or are they just kind of floating there?
Some may be spinning. It depends on the collisions or interactions they've had in the past.
Interesting. So varied. Yeah. Okay.
And we could theoretically spin them up, but whether they're strong enough, because a lot of them are just kind of amalgamations of collected rocks that have kind of drifted together over the millennia, or whether we could spin them fast enough to produce any kind of internal gravity is pure speculation at this point.
Okay. So then past Saturn, we have Uranus and Neptune, and I'll just throw in Pluto for good measure,
Yeah.
acknowledge my childhood. So we're getting even further away now from the sun, and we're dealing with cold, 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 cold. Now we're past Saturn and Jupiter. Does Uranus and Neptune still present the same radiation concerns?
To be honest, I don't know. They are both gas giants, same as Saturn and Jupiter. So I would assume that they would have certain characteristics in common. Um, they're kind of the forgotten gas giants because I never really think about them.
I know, me
Um,
too.
and you know, as a kid, I could never remember which order they went in. So who is going to want to live around a planet called Uranus?
Yeah, I know.
Um,
Poor Uranus is just the butt of everyone's jokes.
yeah,
Yeah. And then Pluto, which I think, of course, lost its planet status about 15 years ago, I think now,
yeah,
because it didn't follow what I think there's three rules of what qualifies as a planet. One is it has to be spherical. Two, it has to be the only one in its orbit. And the third one, I'm forgetting, something to do with gravity, maybe.
right.
But then, of course, we found other objects in its orbit. And is Pluto part of the Oort cloud, or is the Oort cloud just beyond Pluto? Because I think Pluto
Um,
has a strange orbit, right? It's not circular; it's very elongated.
yeah, it's very sometimes it actually dips inside the orbit of Neptune
Mm-hmm.
um, for periods of time, and we've discovered things of a similar size.
So if you
Um,
wanted to live on Pluto, you're going to be constantly changing like the atmosphere is going to be constantly changing on you. The times where you shift further, before Neptune and then further out, going intense cold to little less cold. So that's probably the most unstable living condition. And
yeah,
don't even bother colonizing.
no, no. I think it's been classified as a Kuiper Belt object, hasn't it? And the Kuiper Belt is
Oh, that's the Kuiper Belt. Okay, so the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud is beyond the Kuiper Belt, or
the
how? I'm
the Oort cloud. I think starts like around an astronomical unit is the distance from the Earth to the Sun, and I think if I remember correctly, the Oort cloud starts about 2,000 astronomical units out,
Oh,
so
okay.
way the hell out there, and extends sort of almost all the way to Alpha Centauri. I think about 3 light years.
Okay.
So it's very sparsely populated and very far out. Um,
It's like the edge of the solar system.
it's like it's. I think it's beyond the heliopause. It's just
Okay.
way out there.
Okay.
Um,
I took 3 astronomy classes in college. That was years ago. I'm so I clearly I need to polish up.
but there's some speculation that out on the edges where you know the gravity of the sun is so attenuated um, that planetesimals on the outer edge of this Oort cloud may sometimes swap places and slip into the Oort cloud of sort of Proxima Centauri or other nearby stars and then swap back again. There may be this constant swapping going on as these distant feeble gravities of these stars kind of one
Oh,
becomes slightly
interesting.
more and there's some speculation of kind of panspermia or the propagation of the ingredients for life through the galaxy through this process.
Of the switching back and forth like that friction.
Yeah, and then occasionally if there's something disturbs um, the orbit of one of these things, they can maybe fall inwards towards the nearest star, and then they become a comet and sort of deliver those materials into the inner solar system. So
Interesting. And then the process starts all over again.
yeah,
Well, Gareth, thank you so much for joining me on this discussion about planetary colonization in our solar system. But tell me about your projects, what you're currently promoting, anything that you're doing.
yeah. Well, I had a book out in February, a new novel called Stars and Bones, which is the first in a new loose series, and it's set in a universe where aliens came to save the Earth, but they came to save it from us.
Mhm.
And so we've been kicked off the Earth and set adrift in some giant arcs and told not to mess with anyone else's biosphere again because we can't be trusted. And so
Ooh,
and
interesting.
it's kind of like an ecological Battlestar Galactica mixed with some cosmic horror, because the universe turns out to be filled with rather more dreadful things than we were anticipating. So that's out at the moment, Stars and Bones from Titan Books. I'm currently working on a sequel, but again, a loose sequel. This will be a series you can jump in at any point. It's just set against the same background.
Does your book switch between different points of view, or is there one central point of view? And what is the point of view? Is it the human or the alien, or you don't want to tell me?
No, it's written from several points of view. It's written from the point of view of a lady called Erin, who flies a scout ship called the Furious Ocelot, and she's searching for her sister who's gone missing on a scouting mission. And it's told mostly from her point of view, but there are also chapters narrated by her starship, the Ocelot, and by other sort of secondary characters who are involved in the mystery and the exploration and the hideous things that happen after that. It's basically, yes, like my earlier Embers of War trilogy, which was told from lots of different narrators' point of view. It's all told in the first person by different narrators.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Any last words on our subject today?
I hope I haven't sounded too negative.
No, no, you just sound very realistic, and you are a writer and you have to deal with, these interesting challenges to create interesting solutions.
Yeah, because I would dearly love us to become a multi-planetary species at some point.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.